during the war it was requisitioned by the government and trained Norwegian musicians.
Right.
David, a biographical question first. When did you decide to leave Britain, where you were born and educated, for the United States, and why?
I left in 1969. I was, I guess, an academic and had a secure academic position in Britain, but frankly, I found there were more interesting things to do at that time in the United States. I happened to be married at that point also to an American woman, and so at some point or other I thought the academic opportunities in the United States were much more interesting. And I was fortunate to go to the city of Baltimore, and during the 1960s, as you may well remember, there were all these uprisings in the cities. And at that time, I wasn't terribly radical, but I thought I would really like to understand something about what had been going on in American cities. And so moving from Britain to Baltimore was quite a traumatic experience, and I found it a great learning experience, and I'm very, very glad I did it.
And it radicalized you. The shift from Europe to North America actually radicalized you.
Well, there's a sort of joke about, people who are vaguely social democratic. If they go to the United States, they either go to the far right or they go to the far left. And I went to the far left as a result of being translated into the city of Baltimore, which had been, a lot of the city had burned down about 6 months before I got there in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And there was disruptions all over the place, and I quickly and immediately got involved in that, as well as in the anti-war movement and the end of the civil rights movement, which was then, I think, at its culminating point in American cities.
So how long were you at Baltimore for?
Well, I went there in 1969, and I went away from it, and then I went back to it, and I only finally left in 2000. So I was there for, over 30 years, yeah.
And is the Baltimore depicted in The Wire recognizable to you?
Oh, yeah, it's very recognizable, but it's, it's only half of the city.
Yes.
And of course, it has a very negative view of certain things. I mean, you wouldn't know from The Wire, for example, that Baltimore was the first city to pass a living wage ordinance. You wouldn't know that there's some very, very progressive things that have come out of Baltimore. It has that very cynical kind of view of it. When I arrived there in 1969, it was an industrial city with a massive working class presence. By the time you get to the world of The Wire, most of all of those industrial jobs have disappeared. Most of the possibilities of real employment have disappeared, and there are these moments in The Wire where they look across the harbour and say, once there was a big steelworks there.
I remember that.
Once there was a vibrant working class. And even the port itself, of course, was going downhill and becoming automated. So that transition was a very bitter transition for the city to go through.
I thought that was quite well done in The Wire.
Yes, it was, yes. You have to keep it in your mind that this is the context in which this is happening.
But you almost felt that when America saw The Wire, they were sort of stunned by some of the things in it. It's as if they didn't know their own country.
Yes, well, this seems to be one of the scandals, which still goes on, by the way, which is that when I went there in the 1960s, everybody was concerned about the state of, decayed state of inner city life in America, and how daily life was total misery. By the time you get into the 1990s and you get this kind of neoliberalization stuff coming in, you get the repeat of what's going on in the 1960s, but nobody takes any notice. And I think that, therefore, The Wire came as a shock to the consciousness of America, precisely because the neglect.
Not to mention the shock when New Orleans was flooded.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Large numbers of Americans I met said we had no idea. It's like a third world country.
Right. Well, it's, but, it's interesting to me always to think about at what point the middle class people become aware of the extent of poverty in the world. I mean, I came to political consciousness of a sort towards the end of World War II, and I think one of the impacts of World War II was a large segment of the British middle classes finally understood what poverty was about in East End of London and in the industrial work centres. And I think that awareness then has a political resonance. I think it had a very important role in the Labour Party coming to power, and I think some of the reforms that occurred at the end of the 1960s in the United States came out of that, and I would hope that we might, through a greater awareness of what's going on in many of the cities, see a different way to do politics in the United States as well.
Let's come down to the present, on which subject you've been speaking and writing a great deal.
Yeah.
The 2008 crash of Wall Street. Now, initially, when that crash took place, a crash, of the financialized world largely, but which affected everyone, there was a vague feeling, even amongst people who normally were quite right-wing, that this is going to force the system to change and possibly push through some reforms that are quite necessary to stop this happening again. But here we are 6 years later, and they go on merrily, the same way as before. How do you explain this total disregard of reality?
Well, there's a certain reality which I think underpins the surface appearance. For instance, it's striking to me that right now in the United States, the rate of profit of corporations and businesses is higher now than it's been for a very, very long time. So business is doing okay. It's not surprising to me either that the top 1% has recovered its economic position extremely well and has in fact advanced concentrated even more wealth and power. So you could say that the effect of the crisis of 2007, 2008 was a deep kind of blip, but it was quickly made use of. I mean, there's a sort of saying, you should never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think what happened was that corporate capital and the top 1% and the Wall Streeters found out a quick way to turn this to their profit. So you ended up with a situation where they did extremely well and the country did very badly. And I think it's that class dichotomy, which has not sunk into the mass of the population yet, that they are doing very badly against this background of the top people doing extremely well. So the top people doing extremely well means that there's no urgency on their part to change anything in the system. In fact, they are benefiting in many ways from the prolongation of the crisis.
Okay, accepted. We know what they're like and who they are. But what about the people who are suffering? I mean, we haven't really seen a mass response in the Western world. Right. Let's talk about that first. From below against this.
No, I think in a way I would partly put that down to the way in which, in a sense, the neoliberal ethic has been deeply implanted in the populations. I mean, in a sense, from the 1970s onwards, coming out of the eruptions of 1968, there was this notion of personal freedom, but also attached to that was the political system saying, well, okay, personal freedom means personal responsibility. So one of the things that was striking to me about, for example, the fact that somewhere between 4 and 6 million people lost their homes in the foreclosure crisis of this period was when people went around and asked them, why did this happen? They said it was my fault. They didn't say it's a systemic problem. They said it was my fault. I did something wrong, therefore I blame myself. I don't blame the system. And I think the individualization of consciousness about who's responsible for what, which was kind of one of the platforms, hidden platforms, if you like, of the implantation and pushing of the neoliberal ethic into this world of individual responsibility and personal responsibility, actually has made it very, very difficult for there to be some sort of collective response. I mean, if 4 to 6 million people have lost their homes, you would expect there should be some collective uprising around this. But also, I think the lack of political organization which could actually take up this crisis and say, hey, we need to restructure this system in a very serious way, and it's going to take a lot of political motivation to do it.
So, in other words, the economic crisis did not lead to a large-scale political radicalization of the poor because of the ideological triumph of capital.
Yes. No, I think that's a good way to put it, yes.
That triumph of the late 90s, 1990s,
Yes.
has not been reversed ideologically.
No, it's not been reversed. In fact, in many respects, it's been deepened through, if you like, this politics of austerity, which is in a sense also saying the state has no responsibility for any of this. The politics of austerity are to sort of reduce the debt and reduce taxes, all this kind of stuff. So actually the politics is a continuation in many ways of the politics which has been there since the 1970s onwards.
David, what this brings up now, what you've been saying, is that you've written, and I agree, that this idea which was stuck in people's heads, and probably still is, that capitalism and democracy are intertwined together, that one cannot exist without the other, is a false notion.
Yes.
And that, in fact, capitalism did very well when there was no democracy at all, as it does in China today.
Right.
So, delinking this, do you think that delinking could happen in mass consciousness?
I mean, I always like the sort of Mark Twain line about, the Congress of the United States. He said, we have the best Congress that money can buy. And I love that. And we can say that about democracy. We have the best democracy that money can buy. And so it's a very, very strange democracy we have in the United States. It's a democracy of money power. And I think we have to call it that, and I think people understand that. But at the same time, they can't see how to do anything radically different about it.
I mean, what is going on in Europe now is effectively an Americanization of politics.
Yes.
I mean, if you look at Britain, where we are speaking today, there is no fundamental difference between the three parties, the two parties in the coalition and the opposition. They're part of what I've labeled an extreme center.
Right.
They support austerity, they support wars, they punish the poor, etc., with a few cosmetic things that they don't share. And this is the pattern now increasingly in many parts of Europe.
In the United States, I call this the party of Wall Street, which is in both political parties and, in fact, is organizing and orchestrating the funding of the political program. And so the party of Wall Street effectively governs, and it has two wings, and it's the same party.
Well, here we could say that the City of London governs politics, the Bourse in France, and the Deutsche Bank in Germany.
Yes.
I mean, the symbiosis between bankers and politicians has never been like this before.
Right, and of course the other thing you've seen in Europe is the implantation of technocratic governments that are appointed by the bondholders against the democratic will.
So things apart from Greece, where there's been an attempt with Syriza to create an opposition party, and a very decent party at that. But the panic was so great that Syriza might win that all these other bankers' politicians rushed and told the Greek people, if you vote for them, you'll be punished, your pensions will be lost, there won't be any drugstores left because no one will supply medicines. It was a shocking business.
Yes. Well, that's the way they do it. Of course, it didn't make any difference. They still lost their pensions anyway.
David, just linking a bit of the past to the present, I mean, much more can be done on this front, but I remember in the 60s and early 70s how, when we used to argue with liberals or social democrats, Marx's statement that the state is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, we were laughed at, and at that time it did appear a bit strange, but today, after how the state bailed out these people, it seems very sharp, and prescient.
No, it's exactly right. I've taught Marx's Capital for many, many years now, for about 40 years. And back in the early 1970s, it wasn't always easy to make, Marx's Capital fit with what was going on around me. what has been fascinating is to watch year by year how it became easier to teach Marx's Capital using contemporary examples all around us till you get into the 1990s, where you're completely back in what he describes in Volume 1. And it's just astonishing how relevant that text is to today's world in ways that it wasn't back in the 1970s.
Exactly. And the other phrase which used to drive some people up the wall when I used it was Lenin saying, one of Lenin's sayings, that in the last instance, bourgeois politics is concentrated economics.
Yes. Yeah, well, I think depending on where you are in the world, there's a way of disguising that. I mean, of course, a lot of the cultural confrontations that go on in the United States over everything from abortion to various kinds of rights are about creating masks around trying to not allow people to think too much and deeply about exactly that relationship which you're talking about. But it doesn't take very long for people to actually recognize that that is indeed.
Politics is money.
Yes, politics is money, and that's it.
Which is what that old
Yes,
guy was saying
right,
at the
yes.
beginning of the 20th century.
Yes, right.
Now, you live and teach in the United States, essentially, and you were talking earlier about the changes you witnessed. But over the last 10 years, what has it been like, basically, working in the heart of this empire? How has this material reality affected your own consciousness?
I think in a number of ways. Of course, one of the things that we've had to go through is the war on terror, which has involved us in an increasing militarization of everything. And I think an increasing willingness to depict any dissident organization as actually being either close to terrorism or actually terrorist. So that the police responses to something like Occupy Wall Street or anything of that kind have been draconian in ways which I don't think had been there before. And of course, to some degree that is based on a certain kind of public support, because the politics of fear and the fear-mongering about there are terrorists around the corner, they're about to blow us up here, there and everywhere, and of course the incredible amount of expenditure on surveillance and the acceptance by population that both surveillance and policing is necessary, and that draconian interventions and even getting rid of individual rights and so on, all of that is justified in terms of this war on terror. So I think the war on terror is actually one of the biggest problems that we have politically, because it makes it very, very difficult to even openly explore dissident positions, which, you know, in a free-wheeling kind of way, without coming up against an apparatus that is very quick to intervene and very quick to introduce surveillance techniques and, if necessary, repressive techniques into the situation.
From that point of view, what is the atmosphere like in the academy? Because the American Academy, by and large, used to be fairly liberal. You could discuss, debate everything.
Yes.
But now one hears odd people being picked up, surveillance internally on students, especially Palestinians, etc.
Yes, no, I mean, we have to keep records now of students in our classes and make sure they're all there. There's a great deal of bureaucracy now about reporting on who's doing what with whom. But I think there's a deeper problem with that, which is not so much the war on terror, but, if you like, the corporatization of the university, the neoliberalization of the university, the privatization of even public universities, and, of course, the pushing of funding and that into sort of into the private university. And what's coming out is that indebted students don't create a ruckus. They're much less likely to take to political activism. And there's a parallel here between what happened in housing markets back in the sort of 1930s, when there was this saying that debt-encumbered homeowners don't go on strike. And therefore home ownership and debt encumbrancy was a measure of social control. And actually what we're seeing is the debt-encumbered students. What do? They act in, they're good, they're the good students. They look to kind of get a good job with corporations, which means they're not going to be dissident. They keep away from dissident kind of ways of thinking, even though they might say to you quietly, I agree with you, but I can't do that because if I want to get a good job, I have to do this, that. So they go into business administration or they do something of that kind. So it has, I think, big impact on university, both in terms of its funding, through its corporatization, through its privatization, through the penetration and actually buying of educational influence by large corporations. So there's a real kind of control emerging over the creation and dispersion of knowledge in the universities. But I don't want to give it the sense that it's all like that, because it's not. There's a lot of dissident thinking around in the universities still, but it's increasingly difficult to get beyond, as it were, this kind of liberal ethic which is accompanying the neoliberalization of universities.
Well, I mean, to add to that, that in Britain, a number of universities, not the big ones, have closed down history and philosophy faculties, which was unthinkable 25 years ago, even 20 years ago.
Yes, we see the same thing in the United States, which is the closing down, or not so much the closing down, but the transformation of the humanities into what we call boutique departments. So this is an emergent model, I think, which is really troubling.
One of the things you just said about surveillance and control, I was very struck by the fact that when that appalling event took place during the marathon in Boston and these two Chechen American kids exploded some devices, I mean, of course everyone condemned that. No one asked why they did it. The thing that really shook me and surprised me, perhaps it shouldn't have, was the ease with which the local police effectively controlled the city by telling the population to stay at home, and they did.
Yes.
There was no challenge at all. And I remember watching this on television and thinking to myself, my God, if it's that easy to do it, what is the future going to hold?
Right. No. I think this is what I was saying earlier about the politics of fear.
Yeah.
And how fear is being manipulated now in this political dimension. And this began under Bush, and it continued. I never expected that much of Obama, but I did expect on something
Civil
like
liberties.
this and civil liberties, he would be far, far more considerate than he's been.
In fact, he's released fewer people from Guantanamo than Bush did.
Right. No. So this has been a bit of a surprise, but I think that the security apparatus in the United States is now sort of very, very much in control, and for all I know, is actually controlling the president rather than the president controlling them. I really don't know. I mean,
talking about the United States as an external power, we know what it does internally, but externally, you're of course a famous geographer yourself, but there was I read ages ago Mackinder saying that he who controls land, sea and the air controls the world.
Yes.
And our world island is dominant because of that.
Right.
I mean, there's of course a strong element of truth in all that. But the power the United States has today, militarily, in terms of the sea and the air, is not matched by any other country.
Right.
Land occupations can prove more difficult, but on the air and the sea, and they fight most of their wars now through carpet bombings. So American hegemony, global hegemony, and the position of the United States as a global power is not really challenged by any state.
Right. No, it controls the world from 30,000 feet up.
Yeah.
On the ground, as you say, this is another question, and I think it's been instructive to see that on the ground, actually, the United States is not very good at controlling anything.
No.
But it is this remote-controlled warfare, the drones and all of the rest, that's absolutely crucial. The other aspect of American power is military power, of course, but the other is control over the currency. And I think the fact that, for instance, all debts around the world are actually denominated in dollars, and that a judge in New York City can actually adjudicate the Argentinian debt because the debt is denominated in dollars, that is, again, a sign of a certain kind of global power which nobody else has. And it's been very interesting to see if that does get challenged over the coming decades.
But there was, you remember a lot of talk early on about the European Union.
Yes.
The euro would be able to challenge the dollar, and some countries like Iraq, etc., were thinking of transferring to the euro, but that never really took off.
No, it never took off. And there have been all these proposals. I mean, China has revived it recently about there being a mixture of a market basket of currencies that should actually be the denominating. But of course, that doesn't go anywhere, and the United States is very, very concerned that all debts globally be denominated in dollars, and that gives them a power over global trade and global currency manipulation, so that, of course, the United States is the one country in the world that cannot go bankrupt, because it can simply issue more dollars if it needs them, and it does.
And if any other state did that, the IMF would be there immediately to impose conditions and restrictions.
Yes, no, the one state that needs IMF discipline is the one you can't do it to.
Because it enjoys total and complete sovereignty.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And is unchallengeable.
Yes, right.
And so all these theories which have been floating around, which I haven't been convinced by, the declinist theories, that they go like this: all empires decline. We know this from history, and some even go back to the Greeks and the Romans, which is ludicrous, but they do. And so the United States will decline. Well, no doubt it will sometime or the other, but at the moment there are few signs of it. I mean, in terms of being able to get its way, it often gets its way with most parts of the world. The Ukrainian business, I mean, Putin finally having got the Crimea capitulated on everything else. The Chinese fight back on what is of interest to them, but not on a global scale, posing a global alternative. So, and as you say, militarily and financially, the United States remains dominant. So, do you think that this is an empire in decline?
I think there are many signs, beginning with the fact that when it puts troops on the ground, it fails.
Yes.
There are many signs where it cannot go it alone in the way it used to do. And I think they discovered that back in the late 1980s. I mean, there's some very interesting papers about saying, well, if there's a global crisis of some kind, we can't manage it just on our own. And I think it was interesting to look at what happened around the crisis of 2007, 2008, that the response to that was to ratchet up from the G6 and the G7 to the G20. And now the G20 is still kind of there as necessary for the way in which the US power can be exercised. In other words, it needs to actually mobilize power collectively through the G20. Now, initially in the G20 meetings, the United States succeeded, but recently what we've seen is basically the United States saying we should be doing this, and Angela Merkel says, no, we're not. The Chinese say, no, we're not. Latin America kind of says we're going our own way a little bit. So the G20 is a very fractured organization. In other words, the United States does not control the global politics and the global economy in the way that it did, say, at the end of the 1970s up until, say, even the middle of the 1980s. So I think there are signs of a weakening of the US capacity for control. They have less control over what's happening in Latin America, for example, than used to be the case, because Latin America has reoriented itself in part to China. So what we're beginning to see is some weakening in the US mechanisms of control. At the same time as, of course, we're seeing the consolidation of that power militarily and also over the financial system.